All right, we will jump in now, and folks will continue to trickle in, I'm sure. And we are waiting on the vice president to join us. He's expected here in a minute, but I will go ahead and kick us off and make introductions, and then we'll get to the conversation shortly. My name is Heath Mayo. I'm the founder of Principles First. And I want to thank all of you on the call this evening for joining us. I think this is our second of these presidential town halls. We did one with Will Hurd last week, and it was just a great discussion. And I really appreciate everyone taking the time to join these. I do think that they're important to focus on the issues and the principles that are at stake in this election. I see a lot of familiar faces, and for some of those out there are new. And if you're not aware of Principles First is a grassroots, entirely volunteer organization committed to really championing principles instead of personalities and putting them at the center of our politics again. Our principles are all on our website, but if you hadn't read them, I encourage you to do so. You can find them there. There's 15, but among them are the importance of freedom, importance of rule of law, truth, character, and integrity. And that's really what we're all about on this call. A word on process for this evening. I'll introduce our guest who's just arrived. He'll give opening remarks, and we'll do a bit of moderated discussion between he and I before hopefully having time for a few questions. So with that being said, I'll now introduce our guest. I see him there, and I will go ahead and unmute him or ask him to unmute. It's my honor and privilege to welcome the 48th Vice President and the 50th Governor of Indiana, Mr. Mike Pence. He's born and raised in Indiana, and prior to his time as governor, served 6 terms in Congress, representing the East Central Indiana. While governor, he passed the largest tax cut in the state's history, and he also led on education. He increased school funding. He expanded school choice in Indiana, and I did not know this, but he established the first state-funded pre-K plan in Indiana history as well. Mr. Vice President, it is an honor to have you with us, and I look forward to our discussion, and we'll hand it to you for opening remarks. But before I do, I just want a personal privilege to say thank you for doing your constitutional duty, carrying out your constitutional oath and duty on January 6th, and certifying the election results. It shouldn't have to be said in today's day and age, but given the politics of the day, it does. And so I know I speak certainly for myself as an American, but for everyone on this call that we are grateful for you kind of standing in the breach there under physical threat to you and your family, and doing what the Constitution required. So with that being said, I'll hand it over to you.
Well, Heath, thank you for those words, and thank you for the many nods that I saw on the screen as he expressed them. I've been so heartened over the last several years as I've traveled across the country, how many Americans, literally from every walk of life, and in many cases, every political perspective, have stopped me at airports, stopped me at the grocery store, and expressed the same words. And I'm always humbled by it. But I'm grateful for your kind words. But it's good to be with all of you at Principles First. This is Heath. I want to commend you for your great leadership. I look forward to a great conversation. I'm coming to you from our campaign headquarters in Indiana, but we were on the road for a long weekend in Iowa. We'll be doing a speech on combating inflation tomorrow before we leave the Hoosier State for New Hampshire. But what I can tell you is I'm running for president of the United States because I think this country's in a lot of trouble. I mean, my lifetime of experience in the conservative movement in the Republican Party first took me to the Congress of the United States. I tell people I was in Congress for 12 years, but it seemed longer. But I was actually a conservative leader in the House of Representatives. I chaired the Republican Study Committee and then would go on to chair the House Republican Conference. I saw Republicans lose their majority in 2006 when they walked away from fiscal responsibility and reform. But I saw us win back the majority in 2010. The first time we retired Nancy Pelosi, I was the leader of the House Republican Conference, and so I really do believe that principles matter. It's one of the reasons I was drawn to this conversation, and all of you are drawn to this great organization. That when we stand on principles, which as Republicans to me are a strong national defense, American leadership in the world, fiscal responsibility, pro-growth policies, traditional values, and the right to life, that the American people will rally to our cause. They have again and again, but the converse is also true when we walk away from those principles, including keeping faith with all those that have fought before in the conservative movement, and ultimately keeping faith with the promises that we make to the American people and the oath that we take to the Constitution. I think ultimately we pay a price. And so I hope people see me as someone that's kept my word, not only in those years in the Congress, but also when I was governor of Indiana. Heath, you're very nice to note. We did expand early childhood education in the state of Indiana for underprivileged families for the first time ever. But we also doubled the nation's largest school choice program during my tenure. We cut taxes and balanced budgets and left Indiana with more people working than ever before when I went on to be vice president. And then it was my great honor to serve as your vice president. I'm incredibly proud of the record of the Trump-Pence administration. And while it did not end well with the controversies surrounding January 6th, what we were able to do to rebuild our military, revive our economy, appoint conservatives to our courts at every level is something that I take great pride in. And it really represents, I think, an example of what happens when we have the right leadership in the Congress and the right leadership in the White House. We can move this country forward. And that's the last thing I would just say to you is I'm very optimistic about the future. We're getting a tremendous amount of encouragement as we travel around the country. In fact, I'm told there's a super PAC. I don't get to talk to them at all, but I get to hear what they're doing after the fact. A super PAC out of Texas that's doing a lot of work on the ground in Iowa and in New Hampshire. And they actually have us running second place in Iowa and talking to tens of thousands of people. And I couldn't be more encouraged about the prospects, not only for our candidacy, but for the country. I think America and the American people know that Joe Biden has weakened this country at home and abroad. They're ready for new leadership in the Republican Party and in the White House. And I truly do believe that we're on the cusp of an election that will set our nation back to all the policies and practices that have always made America strong and prosperous and free. And I'm grateful to have a chance to speak to all of you for a little bit this evening. Heath?
Well, thank you. That is an excellent opening, and I want to dive in. We're going to cover as much ground as we can in the time we have. There's obviously a lot to talk about, but I want to start at just a high level because I think one of the most important things that a president does is set the tone and priorities of the administration, of the executive branch, and those priorities typically stem from the threats that the president identifies as most important. And so, there's a lot of things out there, but where we sit today, as you sit here and you look at the world and you look at the United States, what is the greatest threat domestically that we face, and the biggest threat that we face, the biggest foreign threat that we face in your mind, and how would the Pence administration address those?
Well, I would say it very succinctly, Heath, China and the national debt. China is on the move. We see their military provocations on a regular basis in the Asia Pacific. And while we still have the most powerful military in the world today, the trajectory of spending in China on their military, the trajectory of spending on ours, where President Biden has literally been working to cut military spending since he took office, represents, I think, a great challenge for our country going forward. I think our administration in our 4 years changed the national consensus on China. The American people know in overwhelming majorities and in both parties that China is greatest strategic and economic threat to the United States of America. But we need to produce policies that will make it possible for us to achieve peace through strength on the world stage, but also to use access to our economy to really drive China away from years of intellectual property theft, trade abuses, and of course a history of human rights abuses that go on to this very day, whether it be the persecution of Muslim Uyghurs or whether it be the persecution of Christians and other religious minorities. And so I really do believe that our stand with China is critical and vital. I also believe that it's one of the reasons why we should continue as the arsenal of democracy to provide Ukraine with the support they need to repel the Russian invasion, is because I think there'd be no better way to send a message to China that America is the leader of the free world, and we will not tolerate authoritarian regimes redrawing international lines by force. But here at home, look, we've got the worst crisis on the border in American history. We've got a crime wave in many of our major cities. Inflation that I'll speak about tomorrow continues to put a great hardship on families. But at the core, I think, of the greatest challenge for our country is the fact that we have a national debt today the size of our nation's economy for the first time since World War II. And Heath, as you know, and many people with Principles First know, according to CBO, that national debt is scheduled to grow from 32 trillion to 150 trillion in about the next 20 years. And if we wait 20 years to deal with that, if we wait until my 3 new granddaughters are all off to college, all of our choices will be bad. And I submit to you that the way we begin to put our fiscal house in order and combat inflation and save our country from a debt crisis that threatens our economic vitality and our ability to provide for the common defense and meet our nation's needs is we've got to be bold about the need for common sense reforms to entitlements in this country. I'm somebody that says everybody over the age of 40, if you we'll make sure you get the same deal in Social Security and Medicare you've always been promised. But for a lot of people under the age of 40, and I see more than a few on the screen here, I'd like to have a conversation with you about taking those New Deal programs and making a better deal for you. And I believe we can, first by saving the programs for your generation, saving you from a mountain range of debt, and then bringing about the kind of common sense reforms that could be phased in over decades that people would scarcely notice, but it literally would impact the growth and opportunity of our country. I also love the idea, Heath, I have for 15 years of letting younger Americans take a portion of their payroll taxes and put it into a personal savings account. I mean, if we simply let younger Americans participate in the thrift savings plan that 10 million federal employees participate in, where you choose one of 3 mutual funds, if you got 2% return on your investment over the lifetime of your career, that'd be twice what Social Security pays out on the same investment. And that's what I call making a New Deal program a better deal. But I think China and the national debt represent the 2 largest challenges facing our country in the 21st century. But as your president, I know we can meet those challenges.
Thank you. That's a helpful framing, and I want to. I mean, you addressed a lot of things that I was going to ask about, so we'll kind of step through them in a little bit more detail. But you did mention Ukraine, and I think this is an important, really, what has emerged as a dividing line in the Republican Party, particularly among the candidates. You hear different views on this, and I think it is a division that is an important one, a pretty stark one. You have a faction. Along the lines of Tucker Carlson and others who have said basically that what happens in Ukraine doesn't matter. We should care less. We should come home and vote. We can't walk and chew gum at the same time. We ought to focus here at home, and whatever happens in Ukraine happens. Whereas there is another faction who thinks that there is a vital American interest in repelling Putin's invasion in Ukraine, helping them to do that. It sounds like you're in that latter camp. Can you just articulate for us why America's interests are at stake, what they are, and how we can help Ukraine win as this fight continues on now for some time.
Well, let me say first, I love how you framed it, Heath. Look, I think anyone that says that we can't solve the challenges facing American families and be the leader of the free world has a pretty small view of the greatest nation on earth. We can do both. As president of the United States, I'll do both. I have the experience, I have the background. I know how to face the challenges here at home, but I hold to the view that Ronald Reagan expressed in his State of the Union address in 1985, a view that came to be known as the Reagan Doctrine, which the way Reagan put it was, look, if you're willing to fight the communists in your country, we'll give you the means to fight them there so we don't have to fight them. And so I think the fact that the Ukrainian military now for a year and a half has been willing to fight a brutal, ruthless, and unprovoked Russian invasion, and not just fought them to a standstill, but as you can read on the front pages of newspapers, is actually now beginning to make progress in moving the Russian line forward, is a great tribute to them, but it's also a great tribute to the support the American people have given them. And I'm somebody that really does believe that by giving the Ukrainians what they need to repel the Russian invasion, we'll not only get we'll get Russia back in its lane, but we'll send a very clear message to China and, frankly, any other authoritarian regimes in the world that America is the leader of the free world. We will lead the free world against efforts to redraw international lines by force. Now, let me say all of that. I do believe that President Biden has done a terrible job explaining our national interests there. And also, the Biden administration has been slow in providing military support. When I made a quiet overnight trip into Ukraine a month and a half ago, I went to some war-torn cities that were part of the initial invasion north of Kiev. I met with President Zelensky and his military leaders, and I heard them lament the fact that they were still waiting on the tanks that Joe Biden promised them back in January, and they were still waiting for a green light on F-16s that we only recently told them that we'd trained pilots for. Look, Joe Biden said in his State of the Union address that we're there as long as it takes. It shouldn't take that long. I mean, we are the arsenal of democracy, and I really do believe that marshaling the resources of our allies, giving them what they need in much more rapid pace, is the most effective way to not only give them the means to succeed, but also to drive Russia's military backwards. And at the end of the day, that's what'll be necessary. I love the old saying, because people say, well, what about a negotiated peace? I love the old saying that I learned back on my days on the International Relations Committee that one does not negotiate peace with one's enemies. One negotiates peace with one's defeated enemies. And I think we give the Ukrainians what they need. They've been able to hold their 85% of their country against an overwhelming Russian onslaught for now a year and a half. I think it's a worthy investment, and I truly do believe it represents American leadership in the world.
Yeah. No, thank you for that, and I think your leadership on that issue has come through very clearly. So appreciate your voice on that. I want to now transition, sort of bring it now to domestic issues, but also with an eye towards China. You mentioned that obviously China are our biggest challenge from a foreign perspective, but part of engaging China, as you mentioned, is our trade policy. And I think trade policy has really been sort of indicative of the division in the GOP, the change in the Republican Party from more free trade, beat China with our economy, and make friends around the world by making goods that are cheaper and more and better than communist countries do. That was sort of the theory of Reaganism and really much of the conservative movement up through recent years, really. That does not seem to be the case. The Trump administration passed something like $80 billion worth of tariffs on $380 billion worth of imports, and not just from China, but from other country allies like Canada, Mexico. This was on steel, aluminum, washing machines, sort of you name it. And the Biden administration, this has sort of been bipartisan agreement to some extent between the Trump administration and the Biden administration, who's left a lot of those tariffs in place. Would a Pence administration change that tariff regime? Would free trade and economic relationship, Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, for instance, is that in the toolkit of a Pence administration in terms of re-engaging China or putting pressure on China? How do you see the America's trade policy moving forward?
Well, I think it's a wonderful question, and I'll give you a really short answer, which might be more welcome than my previous ones. My policy would be free trade with free nations. I think you can create a tremendous incentive for reform by rewarding access to the most powerful economy in the world to nations that respect the right of contract, private property, or free market countries. And for my part, I don't know why the Biden administration hasn't moved out on a free trade agreement with the UK. We had set the stage for that. I went to the city of London that this black tie affair in 2019, and we announced as soon as Brexit was over that we were going to initiate discussions for a free trade agreement with the UK. We were in discussions with the EU for a free trade agreement with the EU. I had preliminary discussions with the Deputy Prime Minister of Japan for a new free trade agreement with Japan. We updated the Chorus agreement with South Korea, and of course, the USMCA was the largest trade deal in American history, and I really do believe that but the way we move forward with China, because I saw them move, is when we imposed those tariffs on Chinese goods coming into the United States. China came to the table, Heath, and a lot of people forget about January of 2020, before that pandemic struck our nation. China came forward with a phase one trade deal. They haven't lived up to a whole lot of it from what I read in the newspapers, but it's what finally got them to move. And I really do believe that the principle that I would bring to the Oval Office is free trade with free nations. Let's lean in to expanding access to markets around the country that respect the rule of law, private property, the right of contract, free markets. But at the same time, let's use access to the most powerful economy in the world to drive the kind of reforms, not just open access to China's market, but also to drive the other kind of reforms that will ultimately advance human freedom in that nation.
Another domestic issue that obviously is going to feature heavily in this election, probably both in the primary and in the general election, is abortion in the wake of the Dobbs ruling. Sure. You've been I would say, outspoken and in terms of putting forth a proposal on this issue. And if I mischaracterize it, please let me know. But I think you have said recently that you are probably one of the only candidates in the race, the first candidate to propose a nationwide ban at 15 weeks. Is that right? And is that, are there any exceptions to that? I don't know if I have heard the specifics Sure. of the policy. Just wondering if you might want to present it to the group.
Sure. Well, let me say, I'm pro-life. I don't apologize for it. I'd love to live to see the day that we restore the sanctity of life to the center of American law, and that we welcome all children, born and unborn, into the American dream. But that being said, look, the Dobbs decision that I was proud to play a role in advising the president as he chose 3 of the justices that returned the question of abortion to the states and the American people. But the dividing line now in the Republican Party, at least, look, the Democratic Party, whatever they say, they support taxpayer funding of abortion all the way up to the moment of birth. That's actually a position that about 10 to 15% of the American people will identify with in polls. It is the extreme position on abortion. But in the Republican Party, I think there's a very healthy debate going on about whether or not the Dobbs decision returned the question just to the states to be sorted out on a state-by-state basis. or whether there's a national role. I hold the view that the Dobbs decision returned the question of abortion to the states and the American people. And the American people elect presidents, they elect senators, they elect congressmen. And so while I think the majority of this issue is going to be resolved, and the greatest opportunity from my perspective for progress will be resolved at the state level, and I'll always be a champion for that. I do believe that there's a place for a minimum national standard that would align American law with that of the European Union and other free countries across the Western world. In most of the EU, abortion is limited after 12 to 15 weeks, severely limited in some cases, an outright ban. And so Senator Lindsey Graham's proposal for a 15-week ban, which would exclude tragic cases like rape, incest, life of the mother, I think is an idea whose time has come. And interestingly, it may be news to some people on the Principal's First Call, but that idea is supported by about 72% of the American people, that it's when an unborn child is capable of experiencing pain, which most experts conclude is about at 15 weeks, that 72% of the American public is prepared to limit abortion after that point in time. And so that to me is an important issue. It actually harkens back more than 150 years in our history, when another large question, there were voices that tried to relegate it to be just a state issue, that it would be resolved on a state-by-state basis. But ultimately, the first Republican president said, we've got to solve this issue. I make no comparison to that debate now or the tragedy of that time to this, but legally it's a similar principle. And so I believe there is a national and a state role. And as president, I'll seek to advance that. That being said, I think the key for Republicans going forward is to have equal measures of principle and compassion. I really do believe that one of the ways that we can make progress on this is by showing as much generosity and care for newborn children as we do for unborn children. I think the state of Texas gave a great example and got very little credit for it, Heath. They passed a strong pro-life bill shortly after the Dobbs decision, but then they appropriated $100 million in new money for newborn care for mothers in crisis pregnancies or underprivileged families. They almost got no press for doing that, but it was a demonstration, I think, of principle and heart that I think is the key to moving this issue forward.
And on that heart question, David French writes a lot about this. A lot of ink gets spilled on the 15-week, what's the law going to be? But if you look at the trajectory of abortions over the time since the 90s, they've been cut in about half, depending on what stat you look at. The number of abortions have been coming down. And I think something like 95% of those abortions occur prior to that 15-week mark. So really, if someone takes the pro-life view of this issue like you do, it's really about reducing the incidence of abortion through a cultural life, making sure women are supported, single mothers, making sure that they can have the resources they need to raise children. How do you see, as president, what can the president do to create that culture to support women and children, such that we're disincentivizing, pregnancies that can't be supported, and incentivizing women to bring their children to term?
Well, I don't think a big one may surprise you, but I'm somebody who believes you can't be pro-life if you're not pro-adoption. And frankly, we need to have a national conversation about adoption reform in this country. I mean, the average adoption costs about $70,000. That's well above the average income of Americans, and in some cases, it's twice the household income of many American families. Just can't afford it. I mean, I think I know a whole lot of forever families, people that have adopted children, brought them into their families, and have incurred great financial hardship to be able to do that, but they've done it out of love and a devotion to opening their home and to being parents. But I actually think that we're looking at the tax code itself. We ought to lean into the effort to make adoption accessible, affordable, to me, that's just one example of the way that we can make real progress in this area. I mean, I wrote in my autobiography, which, by the way, anyone on the Zoom call who wants to know more about Mike Pence can go pick up a copy of it. It's entitled "So Help Me God," but I actually write about the fact that there was a time when Karen and I struggled with unexplained infertility for 5 years. We couldn't get our family started, and so we put in for a private adoption. And but for the fact that Karen became pregnant along the way, we would have been adoptive. We would have been adoptive parents. I'm certain of it. And so we crossed that threshold. We were ready to open our hearts and our homes to a forever family. I think that's a big part of just making it more possible to more people, particularly young women find themselves in a crisis pregnancy, to know that there's a home out there. If you don't feel called to raise that child on your own, we're going to create conditions in this country where people are going to be at the ready to create a home for that little one.
Got it. I want to shift gears, and I see, mindful of time here. I want to shift gears to the state of the race, state of the Republican Party. You're obviously running for president, and you're in the midst of a heated campaign, and the news is shifting here beneath our feet. I think even just minutes before we got onto this call, the third indictment from Special Prosecutor Jack Smith was handed down of Donald Trump. He's obviously the front runner in this race, and I haven't read the indictment in detail, and I'm sure you have not either. But from the early reports of the indictment, it appears that those charges include conspiracy to defraud the U.S. government, to deprive voters of their vote, and tampering with, basically witness tampering in connection with the January 6th committee's work. Now, obviously, this is the third indictment now, and there's a lot of talk in the primary. There's folks who think priority number one ought to be looking at the cases of all of the folks who were unanimously convicted of their actions that day, to pardon them. Some folks have suggested pardoning President Trump if they were president. If these charges are proven like they were in those cases to jury verdicts, is it your view that the president should be held accountable under the law, just like those January 6 defendants were, or should we be looking at pardons for these folks?
Well, January 6th was a tragic day. But thanks to the courage of law enforcement on that day, the violence was quelled, the riot was put down, and we were able to reconvene the very same day and complete our work under the Constitution of the United States. And I've said many times, I had no right to overturn the election. And I told the president that all the way through the morning of January 6th. And President Trump was wrong. His words that day were reckless. As I've said, I think they endangered people at the Capitol. But at the end of the day, I believe that because of the courage of law enforcement, that day became a triumph. One of the most inspiring moments of my life, Heath, was when we reconvened the Senate that day. And I read a short statement that I had written in my vice president's office just off the Senate chamber. And I commended law enforcement. I grieved the loss of life that had occurred. I thanked the heroes that were forged that day. And then I thanked people in both political parties that had stayed at their post and done their job. And then I closed my folder and looked up and said, now let's get back to work. And the Senate's a pretty quiet place, Heath, as you know. But I was deeply moved when members of the Senate rose to their feet and applauded, not for me, but I think for the resilience of our institutions. And I think with today's news, and I have not had the opportunity to review the indictment. I think with today's news, it's more important than ever that while the president is entitled to a presumption of innocence and is entitled to his day in court, I truly do believe that it's as we decide our standard bearer for our party going forward, it's important that we do so in a way that recognizes that no one who ever puts themselves over the Constitution should ever be president of the United States. It's the oath that we take, and to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. I know I kept my oath that day. By God's grace, we stayed at our post and we finished our work. But I want to let that process work. I don't want to prejudge an indictment that I haven't reviewed. I don't want the president not to have an opportunity to make his case, but I know we did our duty, and I trust as time goes on in our campaign that more and more Republicans will see that. Although I will tell you, Heath, it's I have people from time to time talk to me about the events of that tragic day. But the overwhelming majority of the time, it's when people say the kind of things that you graciously said at the top of this call. The people will stop me on a street corner, stop me at a town hall, and say extremely generous things about the stand that we took that day. And so I truly do believe that I think the people in the Republican Party love the Constitution. I think they stand by the rule of law, and I believe they're going to forge a standard bearer that reflects those ideals, and give us a standard bearer that's going to carry us to victory in 2024. And I hope it's me.
So it sounds like decidedly you're opening up pardon inquiries into these folks is not exactly a top priority, but we'll let the process play out. Is what I'm hearing.
Let me say, I've been a governor, so I've actually granted pardons to people, and I will tell you, I have a pretty high bar. I don't think it's appropriate to consider pardons before there's been a finding of guilt or an admission of guilt. But as I've said with regard to any one individual or many individuals, that if I'm president of the United States, we'll give fair consideration to any pardon request. But I've also said that the people on that day that ransacked the Capitol and that engaged in violence, injuring more than 150 police officers, need to be held to the strictest account of the law. And I'll never have any other view. And
that, I guess, is the legal point. The political point is one that the RNC seems intent on forcing an answer to. I know you're if you haven't made the debate stage, that's part of what this call is about, is to help you get there for those who are inclined. But on the pledge, I mean, it would seem to, I mean, the operative question there for everyone is essentially, if Donald Trump is the nominee, will you support him in the general election? And where do you stand on that question? Would you support Donald Trump if he were the Republican Party's nominee?
Well, I'd say standing here today, I've supported every Republican nominee since I joined the Republican Party. And Joe Biden has weakened this country at home and abroad. People sometimes ask me, they say, did you know it'd be this bad? And I honestly have to tell you, I've known Joe Biden a long time, and he's always been that wrong. But I didn't know it'd be this bad. I mean, the radical left is in the saddle in the Democratic Party. Sometimes I like to tell people that, Joe Biden won his party's nomination, but Bernie Sanders won the party. I mean, I think the radical left, socialist ideology is driving the Democratic Party today, and we got to save the country from that. And Heath, it's a hypothetical question about my former running mate. I honestly believe we're going to have a better choice. I think, I hope it's me. I'm going to work my heart out to make sure it's me. But everywhere I go, the majority of Republicans, even if it's not fashionable to tell it to pollsters every day, the majority of Republicans thank us for running, and I see a real determination for us to have a standard bearer that will carry our party to victory, and that all of us will be able to support.
Then I guess I want to close this discussion portion. Maybe we probably have time for one, maybe two questions. I want to be respectful, obviously, of your time. But in light of
No, I'm
that,
grateful.
in light of that, I'm a card carrying. I was a card carrying Republican for the longest time. In full transparency, I mean, I was my first presidential vote was for John McCain. I was at Mitt Romney's, presidential. I've been on the ground in New Hampshire for Marco Rubio in 2016. And it's fair to say I've been disillusioned since then. And I think many on this call feel similarly. And I think it's indicative of the challenge that the Republican Party is facing. And I don't think I've ever seen it this way. And I think it's fair to say that the Republican Party of Reagan, of Bush 1, of Bush 2, certainly even of John McCain and probably Mitt Romney is just not the same Republican Party that we see today. And the question that I grapple with is, we can talk about, you've long said, for instance, you're a Christian first, a conservative second, and a Republican third, in that order. And I just, I agree with you. I have policy issues with the Democratic Party, but there has to be a line at some point where we look at our party and say it just doesn't. And I think we see this today. The divide in the party is over some fundamental principles. I mean, whether America should lead in the world and support Ukraine against Putin, whether we should be a free trade country, whether we should use the state to punish companies like Disney for saying the wrong thing, and in the instance of President Trump, he said he'd suspend the Constitution. He said a number of things that are just go to the core of what it means to be a rule of law, limited government conservative. And how do we bridge that, what seems to be such a fundamental divide over core principles, and pull the party in a better direction? It's not a very clear question, but I want to voice that frustration and understand from you when you go to these Republican gatherings. And I mean, for instance, you should not have been booed off of the stage. You weren't booed off the stage, but you should not have been confronted with jeers when Tucker Carlson is pressing you over supporting Ukraine and defending them against Putin's invasion. Are these differences reconcilable? And how do we bring the party, but also just the country, in a better direction?
Well, Heath, I obviously need you in New Hampshire, as near as I can tell. I mean, I love your passion, your evident love of our principles and of the country. I commend you, but I want to encourage you and encourage everybody on that. I know that there's a healthy minority in the party that is prepared to walk away from American leadership in the world, is prepared to walk away from our commitment to fiscal responsibility and reform, and the other issues that you mentioned. But I want to tell you, I still believe the vast majority of Republicans are with us. I mean, I was out in Clinton County, Iowa on Sunday night, and they told me that the average number of people who came to the Clinton County Republican dinner was 150. I was the keynote speaker. They had over 300 people there. Karen and I like to hand out plates at dinners because it's a nice way to meet everybody. If you want a good tip about politics, we handed out the plates. I had one person, who said to me he had a problem with what I did on January 6th. The rest was waves of standing ovations. You can go to C-SPAN and look it up. It was very humbling to me. I don't say that as to be self-aggrandizing. What I'm saying is many more are with us than are with them. Okay. And frankly, I have great compassion on the people in that part of our movement, because I think that they were misled about January 6th and still have been. And I think they've been misled about America's obligations in the world, and they aren't being told the truth about what the debt crisis faces for our country. And I think they will respond to common sense, conservative leadership that will express those things and lead us forward. But I just have a lot of confidence going forward. It's I honestly believe that it's not that this is still Reagan's party or it's Goldwater's party. This is a conservative party that still believes in limited government and believes in the Constitution. I'll never forget. I'll leave you with one anecdote. It was the night before January 6th, and I was in the Oval Office. I wrote about this in my book. The president asked for a private meeting with me to talk things over. And I made my position very clear with him. And the crowd was forming out for the rally just outside of the South Lawn. And the president pointed out the window and he said, "You see those people out there?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, I saw it, Mr. President. It's a lot of people. And he said to me, "Those people love us." And I said, "Well, they love you." And he said, "Well, that's probably right." And then I looked at him very seriously and I said, "And those people love the Constitution." And I've had nothing in the last 2.5 years to convince me otherwise, Heath. It's just a function of leadership. And I promise you, with the support of people on this Zoom, with people of principle, to have your support, your participation, your volunteerism. We are working to get on that debate stage. I think having a solid, proven, Reagan conservative on that stage would be a good thing. And as well as I honestly believe, with all humility, I think I'm the most qualified person to be the next president of the United States. So we've been working hard to reach the 40,000 threshold. If anybody felt inclined, if you left this Zoom call and just told every single one of your friends to go to MikePence2024.com and give a modest contribution, that'd be a help to us. We're confident we're going to get there, but we're not there yet. I haven't been giving away gift cards or soccer tickets or kickbacks. We're just doing it the old-fashioned way, asking for support. And I'd be grateful for anybody on the Zoom today that would take a minute, make a contribution, but even more important, tell your family, tell your friends to log on and help get Mike Pence on that stage. And I promise you, we'll be a voice for all those values you just so eloquently described, Heath.
Well, thank you very much. And I want to apologize. I see a lot of hands raised that wanted to get in on this discussion, but unfortunately we have run out of time. And I want to be respectful of the time constraint. But I appreciate everyone for being here, for engaging. We'll continue to do these with as many of the candidates as we can. I think it's important because there aren't really a lot of forums, surprisingly, where you can talk about principles and talk about the ideas in the tumult of this campaign. And I think that this has been a welcome space to do that. But Mr. Vice President, thank you so much for being with us. It was an honor to have you here. Appreciate you answering the questions and having this discussion with us. And again, I'll just reiterate, if you're interested in giving $1, the way the debate qualifications work is that discrete donors matter. So if you're interested in having as many of these voices on the stage to combat some of the other forces in the party that we might more forcefully disagree with, I mean, I've given the $1, and I encourage everyone here to do the same. I think it's important to have as many of those voices as we can on the stage, making principled cases as much as we can. So, Mr. Vice President, thank you so much. Thank you to everyone on the call. And with that, we will conclude it. Thanks.
Thank you, Heath. Thank you, everyone. It's an honor to be with you. God bless you.